Welcome all to Softcast for this week's special episode. I was lucky enough to have prolific scientist and author Dr. STefania Sенеф on with me to discuss the politically charged and thus pretty confusing issue of mRNA. It is a heavily politicized, emotional topic, there is no doubt. The danger of dissent is that many people are understandably scared, sick of being locked indoors and facing immense pressures financially, psychologically, and health-wise. And they are being sold the idea that there is an endpoint here. There is a clear, certain way to end it. And those who dissent or question, unfortunately, with life, as most of us know, for those anticipating a simple cause and effect scenario or outcome, things are, of course, much more nuanced and complex than this in complex systems. And typically, as with much of the material you'll hear spoken about references a research paper Dr. Sенef published with co-author Greg Nye to which I have linked. It is a highly technical entry if you're a pleb like me, however still worth reading for understanding the extent of how little we understand about what might happen as a result. Stephanie has an intimidating academic record as a senior research scientist at MIT, where she has had continuous affiliation for more than 5 decades, after receiving 4 degrees from MIT in biophysics, electrical engineering, and computer science. She has conducted research in. Stephanie is currently a senior research scientist, being MIT's highest research rank at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. However, for over a decade, since 2008, she has directed her attention towards the role of nutrition, and here we continue very much in the same vein as the species intervenes in another natural process. And what could this mean for us in the future?
It's a strange world, I'll tell you.
Absolutely bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. And that's kind of why we're here talking, I guess, is to try to make some sense out of it. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, particularly considering the rather unique times in which we're living. And I think your messages are quite important. I initially came across your work on the herbicide Glifosate, or Roundup, as it's more commonly known. I had for some time been interested in promoting regenerative agricultural practices, and obviously people dealing with these themes often come across topics like Roundup and herbicides and various other things. More recently, after getting in contact with you, you expressed another interest, which I guess fits the theme of human folly, at least from the perspective of some people, and that is the impacts of mRNA vaccines, specifically for the coronavirus. And that will, of course, be the subject that we'll look in detail into today. Thematically, I think that these two subjects are not necessarily too different. They are, in a sense, a kind of manipulation by humans of what we'd call natural systems, in which, I guess, mechanisms in nature, molecules are involved are apparently conditioned in nature to have certain aversions and reactions, and humans have come along in their own way with their own ideas and have attempted to solve problems as they see them. So to start with, can I ask, in a biographical sense perhaps, how did you fall in with these kinds of concerns and issues, since I actually believe you're an AI researcher by trade?
That's right. I spent most of my career writing software to allow computers to communicate with humans using natural speech. So precursors of iPhone, Siri, and Amazon Echo. Around about 2007 timeframe, I was getting concerned because I saw the autism rates going up year by year, and I recognized that if the trend continued, we'd be in big trouble in a decade or two. So I wanted to figure out. I knew it had to be something in the environment. They claim it's genetics, but genetics doesn't change that fast, so it had to be environmental. And I was determined to figure out what it was. And I looked at vaccines actually for quite a bit. That was one of the things I looked at, because a lot of people were saying the child was fine until they got the MMR vaccine, that sort of thing. So, but after 5 years, I was pretty sure I didn't have the answer, and I was getting frustrated. I understood a lot more about what autism is in terms of, the kids have a lot of issues besides their cognitive problems. With a lot of gut discomfort and bloating and diarrhea, constipation, lots of problems with their gut, a lot of them. So I felt it was something that was poisoning them that they were eating. And I didn't have any idea that it could be glyphosate because, like everybody else, I believed it was perfectly safe. Although I knew it was very pervasive in the environment. And it just turned out I happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber gave a 2-hour presentation on glyphosate. I did not know the word when I walked into the room. That was in 2012. After I heard the presentation, I was convinced I had found the answer. It was that clear because the things he talked about that he felt glyphosate was causing were things that I saw in autism. It fit extremely well. And I feel like my first instincts were right. After looking now for almost a decade, I'm even more convinced than ever that glyphosate is the primary cause. And it's not just autism. It's obesity, diabetes, fatty liver disease, pancreatic cancer, thyroid cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Alzheimer's, ADHD. I mean, there's a huge list of diseases that are going up dramatically in the population in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. And of course, they come back with correlation doesn't mean causation. But in this case, I think it does. And my book, Toxic Legacy, which has just come out July 1st, I have it here. This book goes into detail about what I believe to be one of the insidious cumulative mechanisms of glyphosate to cause all of these diseases. It's quite remarkable. The mechanism of toxicity disrupts proteins throughout the body, and that's how these diseases happen. Absolutely fascinating metabolism biology story, I believe. For me, it's gripping. I think a lot of people get their eyes glazed over with all the biology, but I tried to simplify it for the more general audience. I worked hard to simplify the biology, but I think it still can be a reach for some people. But it's fascinating, really fascinating stuff.
I can attest to that. The book is really excellent, and I'd recommend to the audience to check it out. I believe people don't really understand the mechanisms in the human gut and how much they do impact our general health, whether it's mental or physical. And this is actually something that I guess science is just starting to comprehend. So it's definitely possible that there are mechanisms that we don't understand that glyphosate could absolutely be impacting, and we just wouldn't know to look for it.
Oh, that's so true. And in fact, we're looking for it now because we're seeing the dysfunction. We're seeing that when the microbes get out of balance, lots of bad things happen. And so now there've been some really great papers that have come out with huge amounts of data analyzing the whole proteome of the gut microbiome. I mean, it's massive, efforts with computers that are able to cast a broad glimpse over the complexity of the gut microbiome. And they're realizing that, everybody's microbiome is unique. There's certain trends that are associated with various diseases. And there's certainly a sort of general characterization of pathogens, growing too many pathogens, too few beneficial bacteria, overgrowth of yeast. These kinds of patterns are happening. The gut is too basic, so we're seeing that the colon is somehow the pH has been changed over time. And I think the glyphosate is causing this increase in the pH of the gut, which is then causing a very big imbalance in the microbes. That's then causing a loss of critical metabolites and certainly the critical enzyme that glyphosate famously disrupts in the plants, which is called EPSP synthase, is an enzyme that many of our gut microbes have, and many of them have a version of it that's sensitive to glyphosate. And I think that's a key factor in how it disrupts the gut, because it's killing off these beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria that have this sensitive gene and that we depend on for many nutrients that our own cells can't make for themselves. So we are realizing today how many different things the gut microbiome does for us, for the host. It's really a symbiotic relationship. And in some sense, I think we're kind of what we are is a home for the microbes. That's really what defines us more than anything else.
Have you heard of this notion of the holobiont? And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's this idea that human beings as a cluster of wandering cells, I guess we could describe it that way, are hosts to the microbes, as you say, and that not only our food choices affect the dysbiosis that most people seem to have these days, but also that there's an evolutionary framework here in which the microbes that inhabit us engage in things like horizontal gene transfers and the swapping of genetic material between us and the microbes, and that something like glyphosate could literally be impacting our evolutionary trajectory?
Oh, I totally buy into all of that. It's so fascinating. And even, I think the viruses, we hear all about COVID-19 these days, and then all these different viruses. We have lots and lots of viruses in our body all the time, and they're not doing harm. And in fact, I think the viruses, and there are viruses that infect bacteria, there are lots and lots of them. The numbers are staggering. Viruses that infect bacteria, that infect humans. It's just like this mass of life. Life forms, their genetic, their collective genome hugely outmatches ours. We're like 1% of the genomic information in our body, our own cells. We're really puny compared to the information content of all these species that inhabit our body. And they're able to, as you say, to exchange genes and then to exchange genes with us. And I think the viruses are a major agent of human evolution, eventually working their genomic code into our genome, and often to provide us with critical new raw materials to help us solve critical problems. So I actually think there's a concept that I have that this virus that we are facing today is actually a biological attempt to help offset the damage that's being done by glyphosate. That there's a positive aspect to it in terms of repairing the mitochondria, for example, that get thoroughly disrupted by glyphosate.
That's an interesting notion. That's not something I've heard before. So let's get into that. Do you think that this virus is natural? Do you think that it was manufactured? I know I don't want to get you in trouble. Feel free not to answer that. But how do you feel about that?
Oh, yeah, well, I've been reading all the literature. We've all probably been swimming in information that's contradictory and really having disconnect between this and that and the other and having a hard time knowing what to believe. That's certainly been the case for me. And when I first heard about the possibility, it seemed plausible to me. And so I've been following the literature and the progression of different ideas on that and its growing strength. It was a conspiracy theory for the longest time. And then all of a sudden, enough information came out that it became very difficult to deny that it came out of the lab. And then it's the question of whether it's intentional or accidental. And then there's the question of what was the purpose of developing these viruses in the lab. So there's many layers of questions beyond that first one of whether it's a natural virus or a synthetic one. I guess my best guess would be that it is coming out of a lab. That it did, and I suspect it evolved. My theory would be that it evolved in the context of mice that had been engineered to have human ACE2 receptors. They're doing absolutely wild things in these labs. You have no idea. I am so stunned by the capabilities that they have to do these incredible research projects that involve manipulating life these days. There's a lot of power there, and they're very excited about these messenger RNA vaccines because they believe they're going to be powerful for healing disease. I think they're not going to get over the hurdles. And so the virus itself has portions of it that look like they must have been intentionally inserted. And we have the full technology today to assemble that virus from scratch. So if you have the code, once you have the code, you can just write it out and make the DNA with the technology that we have today, which is really quite awesome and terrifying at the same time. That humans have gotten way ahead of themselves because we've developed capabilities that are beyond our understanding, and we're manipulating life in ways that we have no idea what the consequences will be. And I think that this virus may be an example of a consequence that was unanticipated, but has really, caused a huge disruption of the entire globe as a consequence of what seems like a minor thing, a leak of a microbe from a lab. Really stunning concepts there that are hard to get your mind around.
Sure, I can attest to that. I have zero bioscience background. I possess a fairly pedestrian intelligence at best, I would say. And I know that compared to the population at large, I'm probably better informed. So given the complexity of these things and given that no one really understands them, or not many people anyway, I think there's a real danger there that people are potentially being subjected to things that they just have no comprehension of at all.
Right, and people are producing things that they have no comprehension of. That's what's scary. These scary. People, these mad scientists in these labs that are creating these things that they do have some clues, but they seem to want to ignore them, of the consequences, of the negative consequences. They somehow want to hope that those will go away because they're seeing trouble very clearly, and yet they're just in denial. It amazes me how much what the risk they're willing to take with the entire world population, with respect to both the virus and the vaccines.
Absolutely. It's quite worrying. For me and the audience, we hear a lot about the mRNA vaccine, mitochondrial RNA vaccine. Firstly, to keep it simple, what is RNA? What is a virus? How does it differ from DNA in a basic biological framework? And then I guess we can talk about what is the messenger RNA and how does the vaccine propose to utilize it?
Right. And yeah, well, so those are very basic questions in biology. And there's kind of a mantra in biology that sort of the basic principle of biology is this DNA to RNA to protein concept, where the DNA is the genetic code that's in your genome, in your nucleus of all your cells. That's the human DNA. And then, of course, there's DNA in all these other organisms that have their own personalized DNA in their genome. And that's what they call the code of life. And it's made out of just 4 different units, which are called nucleotides, and they use the letters ACGT to describe them. So it's just a sequence of these 4 letters in a certain order that characterizes the code for a particular protein. It's quite fascinating, really. And you peel off the code 3 letters at a time, and the 3-letter sequence maps to a specific amino acid. And there's about 20 of these amino acids. You could make 64 different 3-letter codes. So there's a lot of redundancy. So sometimes several different codes code for the same amino acid. But you can just read off the code and assemble the amino acid to make the protein. And that's what happens from the RNA. So the DNA gets converted into RNA, which is a very similar molecule, but not quite the same, but also still has the code. And then the RNA gets transported into the cytoplasm, where it then makes the protein. So the protein is assembled from the RNA code by a set of proteins that are involved with that process. It's kind of circular. It's kind of interesting that they can make themselves, but the ones that can make the proteins from the RNA know how to make themselves from that code. But anyway, so the proteins are turned out according to the code from the messenger RNA, which is a sort of piece of the full genomic spread. Pieces of it are pulled out as messenger RNA, which codes for specific proteins. So there is a particular protein in the virus called the spike protein, which is in its code. And that turns out to be a really critical protein for the virus. That's the protein that allows it to bind to these ACE2 receptors. I don't know if you've heard about these ACE2 receptors in our cells. That's how the virus gains entry, by binding to those using that spike protein. And then that spike protein then reshapes itself and allows the virus to get into the cell. So it acts like a spear and goes in and delivers the RNA code into the cell. So that spike protein is really, really important for the virus. And the idea with these vaccines is to just take that one protein, not the whole virus, just that one protein, make this artificial messenger RNA unit out of it, which is the code for that particular protein, and then package it up inside these particles, nanoparticles that look a lot like LDL, the lipid particle that people have in their blood. If it's too high, they get put on a statin drug. Mm-hmm. They make them look like LDL so that you'll be able to use the cell's natural mechanisms that it has to bring LDL in, to bring in these little vaccine particles as if they're LDL particles. And then when they get inside, they open up and that messenger RNA gets freed up. And that's when it just starts it's all set up to start making protein. The cell can't turn it off. And that protein is very toxic.
Mm. Are viruses, or viri, I suppose, are they alive?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I can't answer that. I can't participate in that debate because they're so interesting, kind of at the edge of life. They're I don't know. It's they're not that different from some things that human cells produce themselves, which are called exosomes. I've been reading a lot about exosomes, and they're quite fascinating as well. And they have a lot of similar properties as viruses. Many of them do have DNA material inside them, very genetic code, as well as proteins, as well as lipids. So it's kind of the same, in a way, very similar to the virus. And so at what point does an exosome become a virus, or what is the distinction between an exosome and a virus? The boundaries become a little unclear. And we don't think exosomes are living things. So the virus depends upon the host to be able to reproduce itself. So in the sense that it can reproduce itself, maybe that's a definition of life, and it has that property, but only with the assistance of the host. So it's a sort of a parasite, I suppose you could call it, in that sense.
It is worrying then that we're tampering with something like this with little knowledge or ability to define exactly what it is.
Right. Yes, I remember being fascinated by viruses as a child. I had a whole series of science books I would get every month in the mail, and there was one that was on viruses, and I read that book. I was so fascinated. I was probably like in my early teens or something. I just was mystified by this concept of these tiny things that were sort of somewhere between living and not living, you know. So it's been a long ride with me with the viruses. And when I was at MIT, I actually spent 1 year in the biology department working in David Baltimore's lab, where they were working on retroviruses. And they were the people who discovered this concept of RNA going back to DNA through these retroviruses, things like HIV. And so I've had some close experiences with viruses in my previous career. So
How interesting, yeah. I heard a theory once that perhaps RNA was the initial condition of life on Earth, and that DNA came along and effectively parasitically used it to build on top of it. What do you think of that line of thinking?
I've heard that too, and it makes sense to me because RNA is at the center. I mean, it can make the protein and it can go back to DNA using this retroviral enzymes. And in fact, humans have enzymes that can convert RNA to DNA as well. And I recently read about these line 1 enzymes, they're called, and they're really fascinating because they can convert RNA to DNA and they can integrate it. Other enzymes can help them. They integrate it into our genome. So it's possible to take the messenger RNA in the vaccine and get it permanently installed in the human genome. That's not an impossibility. Whether it's very, very rare, I don't know. But, you know, cancer cells have expressed these proteins, and immune cells express these proteins, and sperm express them. And in fact, I found a really fascinating paper on sperm, which talked about the ability of sperm to take foreign messenger RNA, which is exactly what's in these vaccines, convert it to DNA, package it up in these things called plasmids, which are little pellets containing this DNA, circular DNA, ship them out, and then at the time of the fertilization, when the fertilized egg is prepared, the fertilized egg actually takes up these plasmids that are being released by the sperm, all the sperm, not just the one that fertilizes it, taking up these plasmids and retaining them. And these plasmids are able to reproduce themselves, and they're able to produce protein. So these are DNA versions of the RNA that's in the vaccine. In theory, this could totally happen because it's been shown that it happens with other proteins that are foreign messenger RNA. It's exactly the same thing. And this paper said those plasmids could survive all the way through the fetal growth and be present in the infant, and that infant could carry those for its entire life and pass them on to its offspring. So that was really, really amazing to me.
It is amazing and also most disturbing when you consider the potential implications of this on the future of the human species. And we'll get to a bit more of that a little bit later, because there are a couple of things in your paper that I'm going to bring up now that were quite disturbing in that ilk. So just in general, just to clarify, and with absolutely no judgment from me whatsoever, because I'm very unemotional and perhaps agnostic about knowledge and science. I'm just interested in knowledge. Would you describe yourself as generally skeptical of vaccinations, or is it more so the case that it's this particular mRNA vaccination that you're skeptical of?
I would say that I've reached a point through a long process. At this point in my life, I have decided that I believe that no vaccine is beneficial, that the risk outweighs the benefit for all vaccines. I say that, that's a very strong statement. I have 4 children, and they were all fully vaccinated except for the last one, sort of one of the last vaccines. There was the DDT vaccine. A friend of mine had a child who got a DDT vaccine, ran a high fever, had seizures a week later, was later diagnosed with severe autism, and that planted a seed in my mind. But at that time, this had happened, and my son was due for his booster shot for the DPT shot, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. And I told the doctor, no, he can't have it. And the doctor said, oh, that's not a problem, because pretty soon it's going to be probably taken off the market because there'll be too many issues with it. And that was like in 1983. And in 1986, they passed the law that got the vaccine industry off the hook, so that they could no longer be sued for any damages. And it all came to this vaccine court situation, which was won by the government. And it really opened a huge door for the vaccine industry, and that's, of course, the pharmaceutical industry. And they have been really capitalizing on that. And so since 1986, the number of vaccines that kids get has just gone up and up and up. And I think it's frightening. And we see that children today are very, very sick, with all kinds of autoimmune diseases. I think over 50% of the kids in the United States have some kind of autoimmune disease, chronic disease, and it's just really sad to see that. And there have now been a number of studies that have compared vaccinated with unvaccinated children, and they have consistently found a huge difference in the prevalence, in the frequency of the diseases, the autoimmune diseases, things like asthma and eczema and ADHD and autism, of course. All of these things are at a higher rate in unvaccinated kids compared to vaccinated kids in the studies that have been done. Quite a consistent story, and sometimes by a large amount.
I suppose it's this thing where letting nature take its course is somewhat unpalatable to most people, and no one wants to see children die of diseases or whatever else that the vaccines are purported to prevent. However, I believe I'm more in line with you, that perhaps the juice is not worth the squeeze in many respects with vaccines, and trying to subvert really natural selection, I suppose, isn't it really? It perhaps will lead to worse outcomes down the track.
Yes, and in fact, I've been researching that whole topic because it's quite fascinating to me, and I'm aware of studies that have shown they've compared children who caught measles versus children who were protected through the vaccination, and they compare them as adults, and they find that the ones who had measles as a child or mumps, there's these various childhood diseases that in my generation kids just got through that. The ones who had the disease had significantly less problems with things like heart disease and cancer. So it's really, really interesting that I believe that these infections are a natural part of life, and that the virus in that illness is doing something very important for the host to repair their immune system and to strengthen it. So there's a whole process that's going on there where the virus is actually helping the host to heal. But it's a sort of intense program that has to be painful sometimes, especially if your immune system is sick, which it will be if you've been exposed to a lot of toxic chemicals. So I think that you'll see that the kids who get really sick with the measles are the ones who have immune deficiency to begin with, and they need the virus more than the other kids. The kids who have a healthy immune system, they don't really need the virus, so they clear it right away. They don't get sick. And the same is true for COVID-19. The people who are getting really sick are the ones who have diabetes, obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, all these conditions that are associated with glyphosate. Those are the people that are more susceptible to bad outcomes with COVID-19. And I think it's no accident. It's because glyphosate is disturbing their innate immunity. And I have a whole chapter in my book on the immune system, glyphosate and the immune system. And I show theoretically how I would expect it to cause disruption of critical proteins, for example, in the lungs, the surfactant proteins that normally would trap the virus. They become defective in the presence of glyphosate. And then the virus is able to multiply more freely, and it gets out of hand. And then you get this extreme response of the adaptive immune system that overpowers the body and causes intense symptoms. But the virus is actually achieving an important strengthening. In the end, once you survive the disease, your immune cells have been strengthened. In particular, I believe it's their mitochondria that have been repaired through the process that happens in the lungs in response to the virus. It's quite fascinating.
It makes absolute sense. There's symbiosis all through nature. So why would we assume that the same thing wasn't going on there? It makes complete sense, what you're saying.
Yeah, and I would much rather, even if I had to put up with a week of being sick in bed with a flu or something, if in exchange I didn't get rheumatoid arthritis, to me it would be a very fair exchange. I'd much rather, be sick in bed for a week than to have to put up with rheumatoid arthritis for years and years.
Absolutely. You published a technical article in the International Journal of Vaccine Theory, Practice and Research that I will link in the notes to the show for the audience.
Excellent. Thank you.
So let's set the scene here. When COVID erupted, who collaborated in terms of the companies and, I guess, US government departments mainly to bring about this particular vaccine?
Yeah, well, Pfizer, right, and Moderna were the two key mRNA vaccine companies. And the U.S. government, launched this campaign to get these vaccines out the door as quickly as possible, skipping a lot of steps. And the technology is very, very new and very, very unknown, very much unstudied. So huge questions are left unanswered as far as the consequences that they might have that we just don't know. And so it's extremely bold and reckless to decide that the entire world needs to have this injection done with little knowledge of long-term consequences and short-term consequences as well. It was an incredibly reckless decision, in my opinion, to think that you could fix this problem through these injections. But the governments have, it's so interesting to me how the companies seem to be so powerful and the governments just line up and all of them seem to fall in place to think, oh, yes, this is the only thing we can do to fight this infection. And they've almost intentionally suppressed a lot of natural treatments that could be done early in the disease process that would keep you out of the hospital. And especially, I feel, they haven't said anything about simple things like eating a certified organic diet and getting out in the sunlight, which would be two very important things to do in changing your lifestyle to improve your immune system health so that when you get COVID-19, you don't have a problem with it. They should be shouting that from the rooftops, and the government's saying nothing about that, nothing.
I was commenting to a friend the other day. We were talking about the absurdity of being locked down indoors without any sunlight, with other people. No doubt if you had the virus, you'd be spreading it everywhere and increasing the viral load. No fresh air, no exercise, terrible food, probably for most people eating Uber Eats or whatever else it is. It seems like just about the dumbest thing possible that a government could do is to lock people indoors.
Yeah, it's just crazy because it's been shown in multiple studies that vitamin D deficiency is a huge risk factor for bad outcome. One study, I think, said 90%. They thought vitamin D deficiency could account for 90% of the fatalities. So it's such a simple thing to get out in the sun. I certainly am a sun worshiper, and I really believe in the sunlight, not just for vitamin D, but also for general immune health.
Yeah,
in ways other than vitamin D. Yeah.
Yeah, we're lucky in Australia. We live about 2 kilometers away from the sun. It's so damn hot here. We have abundant access to it. In terms of the corporate influences, and I won't spend too much time on this, but I can attest to the fact, having worked in a corporate capacity for most of my life, that absolutely it's not hard to lobby governments. So I don't understand why people think that that's such a far shot, particularly with huge corporations like this. It's absolutely understandable that they have complete power over politicians and other people. That's not up for question, in my opinion. And in terms of this, he's a controversial man, and you referenced him very briefly in your report, and that's Bill and Melinda Gates and their foundation that supported research in 2018, specifically that you linked to in your report. What is your view of this research report and this particular foundation and their driving motivations?
I'm not actually sure which report you're referring to. Can you give me
It was a report
more
in 2018. It was in your article, and I believe in the report.
It was about the vaccines, vaccine development, or?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and the prediction of how long it would take, and it was like 12 years before these radical new vaccines would be ready for show, showtime, and and that report was saying that it would take a long time, and yet here they are within a few months, they've got the vaccine ready to go. So it was outrageously fast compared to what was predicted in that report. Yes.
Sure. And I believe they classified it into 3 categories, which I found interesting. There was simple, complex, and unprecedented vaccines. Yeah, and simple and complex vaccines, as you said, represent the standard or modified applications of what we have now, stuff that exists and is currently used. I'd like to understand, what is this mysterious, unprecedented category of vaccine? What were they referring to there?
Well, for example, these messenger RNA vaccines, because they are really, really unique and new technology that's never been tried on humans and actually has hardly been tried on animals. So they just really jumped the gun when they thought, this is going to work, because it's so far away from anything natural that you can't imagine that it would just work fine, And so they understood that that if you inject RNA into the body, it will immediately disintegrate, because we have enzymes, very powerful enzymes, that break it apart into the individual nucleotides. Our body doesn't want that messenger RNA to stick around. They knew that, so they had to figure out a way to keep that from happening. And that involved many, many manipulations that ended up with something that was extremely unnatural. So one thing, and we talked about all these steps in our paper, but one thing was these 4 nucleotides, and one of them is called uridine in the case of RNA, and they changed all the uridines in this. So there's 4 of them, so sort of 1/4 of the content is all these uridines, and every one of them was changed into something called methyl pseudouridine, a different molecule. And by doing that, they kind of made it really hard for these enzymes to break it apart. They're working on the idea of keeping it around so that it can make lots of spike protein. Then they also changed the actual nucleotides. Every place they could, they replaced an A or a U with a G or a C, and that made it GC rich, because they knew that GC rich RNA is much better at making protein, makes it much faster, makes much more. And so they manipulated it. So they changed the code of the RNA compared to what the virus was using itself to make it more willing to make lots of spike protein in a hurry. And then they piled in all this polyethylene glycol and mixed that in with the RNA to help to stabilize it, because the polyethylene is these big long molecules that kind of gum up with, they're all conglomerated with the RNA, and that also keeps the body from being able to break it down. Then they added these cationic lipids, and these are not natural. These are unnatural lipids, synthetic lipids, that's fats. Cationic meaning positively charged, because they knew that cationic lipids are something that the cells hate. And when it acts like aluminum, if you're familiar with aluminum in many of the vaccines, they put that in there to make to cause an immune reaction, so
and
that
it gets stuck in the brain, of course.
Right, exactly. So the aluminum is very toxic in many of these vaccines that the kids are receiving, and this cationic lipid is kind of their answer. They couldn't put aluminum into the vaccine, probably because it would wipe out the RNA, but they put this cationic lipid in there, which is positively charged and which causes a cell to get really upset. So the muscle cells are receiving this mess of stuff, and they get really upset, and they call in the immune cells, which is what they want. The researchers want this to happen. Immune cells come in, they take up the messenger RNA packets, and these things look like LDL particles. They're designed to look like natural human lipid particles, so that the machinery in place will be able to take it up. And those cationic lipids also help to open it up so that the RNA gets freed up. And then they've manipulated the RNA to put some stuff on the beginning and some stuff on the end that makes it look exactly like a human messenger RNA protein, mRNA sequence ready to produce protein. They've manipulated it in that respect as well. So there's many, many different changes. And then they actually changed the code for the protein, put in a couple of prolines that cause it to be unable to reshape itself to infect the cell. So it gets stuck on the ACE2 receptors, the version that the vaccine is making. And that's probably also a problem, because it's causing things like heart failure. It's causing myocarditis in the heart. I don't know if you've heard about this, but children are dying following the vaccine because their heart is inflamed. And I think that's because this spike protein that's being produced from the vaccine is sticking to the ACE2 receptors in the heart, which disables them, and that causes an increase in something called angiotensin II, which then causes this inflammatory response that can lead to heart failure.
Sure. In terms of the data regarding the efficacy of this vaccine, the coronavirus vaccine seems to have a strangely high initial efficacy, very much beyond the estimates, say, outlined in the report that we mentioned before. I know, for example, in my own job, if I received, financial data that completely defied my initial estimates, I would be scrutinizing those numbers, because I would think, well, obviously there's a problem here. There's a wrong input, or something has happened. According to your research, what criticisms should be leveled at the initial data sets submitted by Pfizer and Moderna et al.?
Again, I'm not quite sure what you're getting at here.
No, nothing too conspiratorial. I'm just wondering why. So we have the unprecedented vaccines where you have a very small efficacy to start with.
Right. Well, all this business of fixing the RNA is what kept it sturdy, which kept it from getting broken down, which made it produce, and also this accelerated production of spike protein. And the spike protein is really toxic. So the immune cells, make tons of spike protein, and it's toxic, and they just go crazy with that, and they're crying alarms. They don't really know how to deal with this mess. They really have no prior experience of anything this horrible. And they jump into the lymph system. The lymph nodes swell up under the arms. That's a common symptom. They go into the lymph system, they get to the spleen. And we talked about that, how the immune cells pile up in the spleen, loaded with this messenger RNA, furiously producing spike protein that they can't stop doing because this thing has been so elegantly designed. There's no way to turn it off. And we don't know how long the messenger RNA lasts, but the intent was to get it to last as long as possible. Their notion was we just got to make lots of antibodies to spike protein, and whatever way it takes to do that, we're going to do it. And we're going to manipulate. And so they understand how if you do this, it's going to help. If you do that, it's going to help. Let's do it all. Let's do it all. And we'll make sure that we get, and they get a fantastic antibody response, much higher than what you get if you just catch the disease. And that's very, very worrisome because the spike protein has a lot of sequences in it that are similar to sequences in human proteins that are known to be associated with autoimmune disease. And what that means is when you develop antibodies, lots of antibodies to the spike protein, you have a potential to cause autoimmune disease because those antibodies will misrecognize human proteins by mistake, and they'll bind to them and they'll cause trouble. And that'll cause things like multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis and celiac disease, all these autoimmune diseases. Many of them are connected to proteins that it's been shown experimentally that antibodies to the spike protein also bind to these other proteins. So that's very frightening to me. This overabundant production of antibodies to the spike is not a good thing for your general health.
Sure. In terms of the initial problems with the vaccine that people have been having, such as vascular problems or various inflammatory responses, what is the data collection like? Does it leave a lot to be desired, or are you seeing good numbers come through on people that are having bad reactions to the vaccine?
Well, there's tons and tons of reports in the VAERS database, and the estimates are that the VAERS is probably, it could be as much as only 1 in 50 or even 1 in 100 cases that actually get reported in VAERS. VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and it's a very useful system, and I've poured over the data. There's some shocking stories in there of individual cases. And all kinds of different problems. Anaphylactic shock is a really big one, and that's because of the polyethylene glycol. That's well known that is going to cause anaphylactic shock in people who have antibodies to it, and many people do have antibodies to polyethylene glycol. So that's one problem, just because of that contaminant, that element in the vaccines. We're seeing that thrombocytosis. We're seeing this complete drop in platelet counts, almost down to zero in certain people. That is especially in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a DNA vector vaccine. They have their own set of problems. I don't think they're any better than the messenger RNA vaccines, and all of them have the goal of making lots of antibodies to the spike protein. All of them produce the spike protein, which is a very toxic protein. That the VAERS database has, if you look at just death, so people who died shortly after the vaccine, and there's lots and lots of reports. I think it's over 10,000 now, I'm not sure, in the VAERS database. But the number over the first 6 months of this year of death associated with these vaccines, COVID vaccines, is more than the number of deaths reported for all of the other vaccines for the previous 20 years. So, I mean, that's just a huge difference in the number of cases where death is associated with a vaccine. They're much, much more toxic than the other vaccines. There's another thing, Bell's palsy. And Bell's palsy is a risk factor for Parkinson's disease. And I'm very worried about Parkinson's. I think there's a strong signal for Parkinsonian symptoms in general with people responding to this vaccine. But the Bell's palsy is caused by a virus, herpes virus. And there's thousands of reports. Yeah, there's 2,000 reports of Bell's palsy associated with these vaccines, and there's practically none associated with any other vaccine in the history of the VAERS database. So these really, really strange things are happening in response to these vaccines that never happened in response to other vaccines. They're really very, very unique and very damaging. And another thing that I'm really worried about is prion diseases, because the spike protein is a prion-like protein. It has 5 of these glycine zipper motifs that are characteristic of prion proteins. And that's the mad cow disease. Remember, in the cows in Great Britain, they had all this issue with mad cow. It's a protein infectious agent. It's a prion protein that misfolds, and then it seeds misfolding for other proteins that are around. And so the spike protein can act as a seed protein to cause neurodegenerative diseases that are associated with misfolded proteins. And that includes Parkinson's disease, as I mentioned, and also Alzheimer's and CKD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is the human equivalent of mad cow, and ALS. I mean, these are all really debilitating diseases that you don't want. And I am predicting that they're all going to show up in younger populations. They're going to show up in higher prevalence in the future. And it could be years or decades before you actually get the disease. But this, having had this vaccine many years ago, is going to predispose people to get it sooner, to get it more intense. I think, and people to get it who wouldn't otherwise have gotten it. I think we're going to get an epidemic in these neurodegenerative diseases as a consequence of all the spike protein that's being produced by these through these vaccines.
How does the spike protein get into the brain, and what's the link to the neurodegenerative diseases? Does it get into the bloodstream and somehow get into the brain?
Yes, well, actually,
work?
probably, and that's again a theoretical, but there's a lot of studies on Parkinson's disease that are very nice, and they show that it begins with foreign proteins, prion-like proteins from infections in the gut, and then the immune cells respond, and the immune cells go to the spleen. They go to the germinal centers in the spleen, and that's where they can dictate and train the B cells and T cells to produce those antibodies, because you need to have a whole training process to get these antibodies that exactly match the protein of interest. So the spike protein is being carried into the germinal centers of the spleen in order to train the B cells and the T cells, and then what happens is that with that toxic load, the immune cells release these things called exosomes that I mentioned earlier, which are little lipid packets that contain contents. And what they're going to contain is spike protein, because these immune cells are trying to shed. They're making all this spike protein at a high rate, and they can't stop themselves. So they're packaging them up in these lipid particles and throwing them out the door. And then what's happening is, it's quite interesting. They travel down the vagus nerve and up the vagus nerve, and they reach the brainstem nuclei. And the substantia nigra is the critical one associated with Parkinson's disease. So they get in there. Substantia nigra actually has a lot of ACE2 receptors in there. So that spike protein being delivered to the brainstem nuclei is going to be a huge problem for seeding misfolded proteins and causing these neurodegenerative diseases. But that whole thing is worked out with Parkinson's independently of spike. They know that it begins at these germinal centers in the spleen where the antibodies are being built, and they also know we reported in our article about the messenger RNA vaccines being carried into the germinal centers in the spleen. The very same place where these prion proteins begin is the place where the vaccine ends up with these immune cells. So to me, it seems quite clear that we're going to see this increase in these neurodegenerative diseases. And it usually takes many years for the whole process. So it's slowly happening over time. You're getting worse and worse. And you reach some critical point when there's enough of these misfolded proteins in your brain that you start to see symptoms of disease.
Being a male, I guess I'm going to be a little bit selfish for a second. And we did speak about sperm and the effect of RNA getting into sperm cells. What is particularly disturbing to me, and we've spoken a little bit here about short-term effects and long-term effects on individuals, in terms of the species itself, if you introduced a spike protein of this nature into the human genome through the human sperm into the infant, what do you think could carry over into that individual, even if they never had the vaccine themselves? It was their parents that had it.
Right.
What kind of things could we see in the future?
Well, that's really wild to think about the possibility of that. Say an infant being born with spike protein, having been exposed to spike protein in utero because of this whole process, and therefore I think being trained that spike is a human protein, so that infant would be unable to develop any antibodies to the spike protein because it would think of it as a human protein. So if that infant caught the disease, its immune cells would not respond to the virus. And as a consequence, that infant would become a very good spreader of the disease. And there's actually a model for that in an infection, a bovine diarrhea virus in cows that had exactly this problem, that the cows would be born that were carriers, and they were spreading this virus to the entire herd. And so the grown-up cows would be getting sick. Whereas the infant cow the calf was fine. So the calf is carrying the virus and unable to respond to it, but also unable to knock it out. So the virus is a super spreader. So I would predict we would have infants that were super spreaders, is what would happen if one of these infants picked up that code from the sperm.
Do they themselves have protection from it?
Well, the answer is the really interesting thing, and I'm trying to figure out. It's an excellent question. I'm trying to think if they have the ability to make the spike protein, and maybe it comes with some kind of control elements, because you have all these proteins that you can make have control elements that will keep them from being produced except when they're needed. And whether there might be some way in which this prion protein could have some utility in some situation. I mean, we don't understand the role of the prion protein, the human prion protein. We don't understand what it does, but we know it's essential. So if you knock that protein out, you're not viable. If the prion protein that causes this horrible disease, CKD, is a very important protein to the body, but we don't understand what it does. So I find that really, really fascinating. There is something about, I have some theories, but they're pretty wild, so I'm not sure I want to talk about them. But
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe there would be some way that spike protein could actually be useful to us. And maybe that's the ultimate goal of this whole process, is to get it incorporated and controlled. I mean, the important thing is to be able to control when it's produced under probably circumstances of extreme stress where it's needed to somehow solve some critical metabolic problem, something like that. So, I mean, it's wild, wild science.
I'm happy to
Lots
hear
of
your
unknowns.
wild theories, Stephanie, if you're willing to share them.
Well, okay. I mean, it has to do with it gets a little complicated. It has to do with deuterium, and deuterium is heavy hydrogen.
Okay, and that's in water, isn't it? I
Yes,
thought
that's
I
right.
heard
It's a
once that,
natural element in water, heavy hydrogen, and it turns out it's very important to keep the deuterium levels in the water, in the mitochondria, very low, or else they won't work well. And one thing I've discovered is that there are many proteins that are involved in making sure that the mitochondria have healthy water, and many of those proteins are disrupted by glyphosate. So we have, I think, a real problem with our mitochondria systemically in our society because of this problem that we can't keep the deuterium out of the mitochondria. So I have tremendous speculative idea that these prion proteins, these misfolded proteins, are fascinating because all of them have a really important role in the body, and they go into the membranes of the cells. They form alpha helices and they go into the membranes, but they can turn into a different shape called a beta sheet and stick around in the cytoplasm, and eventually they can become these fibrils. So this is like the amyloid beta in Alzheimer's disease, and it becomes these fibrils that accumulate in the brain. My notion, and it's completely speculative, is that those fibrils are able to trap deuterium and remove it from the water in order to improve the deuterium levels in the cell. So they're kind of trapping toxins, if you will, in those fibrils in order to help the neurons to heal. And they found with Alzheimer's, they've got all these drugs that they're playing with. They've invested huge amounts of money with drugs that cut back on amyloid beta, and they've had miserable luck with those drugs. It's really been, I think, a complete failure. But they think because they see those fibrils, they think they're the reason, they're the cause of the disease. But actually, they could be part of the solution. And the real disease is an inability to manage deuterium properly.
Yeah. I'm going to have to re-listen to that, I think. Yeah.
I do want, the remaining time, I know it's short, but I do want to get into ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement. Do you know about that?
No idea. Please tell me.
Yeah, we wrote about it in the paper, and it's starting to look like it's happening. And so we were predicting that it was a possibility that would happen with these vaccines because it's well known that it's a problem. It's been a problem with many vaccines that have been under development over the years and have failed. And some of them have failed miserably after they were already unleashed in the population and they started causing death. And so it's a antibody-dependent enhancement. And what it means is that there are antibodies, to the spike protein, for example, and they do bind to the spike protein. But that binding is, so it's sort of enabling, normally it would enable the macrophages to clear it more efficiently and get rid of it. But there's another pathway that can happen where it actually enables the immune cells to take up the virus and cause it to reproduce. So it increases the ability of the virus to multiply inside the cell. It works the opposite from what you intended. And this can happen as the antibody levels drop. So the vaccine produces huge amounts of antibodies. They kind of coat the entire virus, and it can't do this trick. But as the antibodies wane over time, there reaches a critical point when the person is exposed to the virus, and the antibodies are facilitating the virus's ability to multiply. And that means that the vaccinated people, if that happens, will have an increased risk of infection compared to the unvaccinated people at some point.
And this has been measured with other vaccines, has it? Did I
It
hear
has
that correctly?
happened in other vaccines, and it's happened with coronavirus vaccines. Of course, no one's done it before with coronavirus too, but other coronaviruses, they've had this problem. So it's not, and other kinds of viruses as well. They've had this problem repeatedly with many different viruses, and they've had really struggled with how to get around it. And they're like very, very hopeful that these vaccines won't show that problem. But it's starting to look like they are. And it was looking pretty good for a while, but now it's starting to look like they are. And there's a situation in Cape Cod that was quite striking, and has caused the CDC to decide we have to wear masks again, because they were moving in a direction where vaccinated people didn't have to wear face masks. Now they've reversed that. And it's, I think, because of this incident in Cape Cod over July 4th, a small town called Provincetown. It's a tourist town, and they had a breakout of this Delta variant, which is a new strain, and that's another thing. The vaccines are facilitating the development of these.
I did want to get to that actually in a bit more detail, just quickly. So I have seen data around that the vaccine itself could be encouraging more virulent forms of the actual virus. What's the mechanism that? How does this occur, and do you think that's where the Delta virus strain came from?
Right. I get very frustrated because they're blaming the anti-vaxxers for the development of all these new strains. Yeah. And it's actually, I think, the fault of the vaccines. I really believe that. And we wrote about it in our paper, Greg and I. Yeah. So Greg Nye was the person who collaborated with me on that paper. It's quite interesting because there was a case in UK that we wrote about, a fascinating case of a patient who had cancer. He was in bad shape. He was on cancer immunosuppressant therapy, so he had a wrecked immune system. He caught COVID. He was in the hospital. He was very sick. He stayed in the hospital for 101 days. During that time, they were trying to treat him, and one of the things they did was they gave him plasma. They gave him plasma from people who had recovered from COVID-19 they had antibodies. So people had developed antibodies to the virus by virtue of having recovered from it, and they gave this patient those antibodies from someone else with the hope that the antibodies could help him clear the virus. But because his immune system was so weak, the antibodies didn't work. The virus continued to thrive, and it started to mutate very rapidly. And they observed that, and they were following the actual strain that was appearing. And by the time he died, he had a new strain of the virus. It had something like 12 different mutations in that spike protein. So they are RNA viruses are really good at mutating. And that virus was able to basically work its way around those antibodies because the antibodies were not helping the person to clear the virus, but it was helping the virus to learn how it should reshape itself in order to be able to use those antibodies to its good advantage. So it ends up with the virus winning. You've got these antibodies that train the virus to perfect its own skills so that those antibodies will work in its favor, and that will then cause ADE, and I think that's what's happening with these strains. The Delta strain probably was facilitated by vaccinated people who were sick, people who were immune compromised. It gives the virus a wonderful opportunity to hone its skills, to readjust itself so that it works, keeps the antibodies to work the way it wants them to help it infect.
Would it be different if people just got over the virus naturally and didn't have the vaccine? Would there be a different outcome?
Well, I think we need to just let this virus go. We need to just pretend it's the flu and get on with life. It's killing off. Unfortunately, it's killing people, but the people that are being killed are the ones who are sick already. Yeah. You're seeing all these diseases that are, risk factors. People need to get their health in shape. They need to live a healthy lifestyle, improve their health. Each individual needs to take upon themselves a mission of improving their lifestyle so that they can resist being killed by the virus. And of course, there's ways to treat too. And when you get the infection, people, naturopaths are finding effective treatments involving simple things like zinc and vitamin C and vitamin D. And of course, there's ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. There are these old drugs that people are finding if you use them early in the disease process, you can keep people out of the hospital. I know naturopaths who've treated lots of patients, and not one of them has ended up in the hospital. So it's possible to treat this virus. It's possible to protect yourself from this virus by living a healthy lifestyle. The vaccine is not the right answer. I don't think there's any way that I can see that the vaccine is the right answer to this mess that we're in right now.
The risk factors are there, and you've outlined them really well in your article. I'm just surprised that the scientific community in general are not looking more seriously at these things, because these are potentially catastrophic outcomes for the species.
I know. I agree. It's frustrating. many medical people, I think there must be many medical people who are aware that these vaccines are not working and that they're really toxic, and they don't dare speak up because they can lose their license to practice medicine, which is just really, really sad. I mean, that we've gotten so far away from where we need to be to heal this earth,
Yeah. Some of the commentary I've been seeing online by pro-vaxxers actually mainly is quite disturbing, to say the least. It's extremely aggressive. I've even seen blue check marks on Twitter call for people to be locked up and various other things. Can't go to stores, can't go to shops. And I find whenever things get politicized like that, there's very little chance of a rational argument emerging. Do you see any hope for a rational outcome to this, or are you more negative about where this is going to go?
Well, my big hope is that AIDS is going to bite us in the ass, so to speak. I mean, we're going to be, to speak crudely, I think that if this does happen, that it turns out that vaccinated people are at higher risk than the unvaccinated, which I think may happen in time. They're not going to be able to hide that's happening. They're not going to be able to hide it. And at some point, they're going to have to admit that the vaccine idea has failed. If they're going to get people to line up and get another round of vaccines, and especially people who had already very intense reactions to the first one that really scared them, are they going to be willing to do it again? And especially if they see the first one only lasted for a few months, I don't know how many people are going to be willing to just line up like sheep and get this and have this happen to them until they finally die of Parkinson's disease. I mean, I think it's just, people need to wake up. I mean, people need to educate themselves. You can read the literature as well as anybody, really. You can train yourself. Today, you can look up words on the web. I mean, you can become educated if you really care. Inform yourself. Decide for yourself whether you think it's really okay for you to get injected with these poisons, because I certainly think it's not. And I've read a lot, and that's what everybody needs to do. They need to become informed. And of course, that's hard too, because most of the information is suppressed. And people are coming out with all kinds of horrendous consequences of these vaccines. It's getting shut down from the web, censored. So it's very frustrating.
The creator of the vaccine himself, or this class of vaccine, I think Dr. Robert Malone, I saw him quoted on Twitter the other day. He said, "The biggest challenge with a new pandemic is to recognize what it is, a disease which does not fit the epidemiology and response paradigms of past outbreaks, and will demand effort, resources, unparalleled collaboration, and above all, open-mindedness when formulating responses." And I've got to say, I'm not seeing that anywhere. And this is the guy that invented the things. So if he can't get that message through, I'm feeling...
It's really amazing, isn't it? Yeah. It's just really very respected and well-educated and articulate people who have a lot of good things to say, and they get censored because they haven't gone along with them with the message. They've rebelled against the intention of the people in power. I am just flabbergasted. I just don't understand how we've let the world get to this point. It's really sad. It's a sad statement of the human species, Billy.
It is, and I think it's been politicized. And in times where there is such a demarcation between literally sides these days, two sides, there's no subtlety. It's very easy to use that in a way that you can say, oh, that's a, I don't know, right-wing conspiracy thing, anti-vaxxers are all crazy, and I'm pro-science, and I just believe whatever I'm told. So it gets politicized, and I think by extension, people don't think about it. They're precluded from thinking about it.
And they can't talk about it either, right? Because you won't even bring it up in conversation if you don't know where the other person stands, because you're afraid you're going to get clobbered. It's so amazing. This kind of polarization prevents discussion. We really should be having very active discussions and debates, debates between pro and anti on television. I mean, they really should be doing this to get people to just clarify their point of view, defend it, argue why they believe that way, and make it all very, very active and visible. They're doing the opposite, because they're just clobbering anybody who dares to say that these vaccines aren't perfect.
In terms of the future, I can foresee potentially a future where in Australia, for example, people get the flu shot every year. it's very ineffective, even by their own data. It barely works. The reason it doesn't work is because we base our vaccine on the North American strain that winter prior. And by the time we get it down here, it's often another strain. And as a result, the vaccine probably won't work effectively.
And may even work negatively, because I think that every flu vaccine weakens your innate immune system. So you're more susceptible to the strains that don't match.
Sure.
And to other viruses that cause flu-like symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have viral shedding, which is another thing that you talk about, which I'm skeptical of that as well. Not skeptical of it, but, it seems like a possibility to me that could be.
Well, that's the exosomes, that's the exosomes, I think, because those are little, it's been shown that exosomes can get shed through the lungs, probably through the skin. In the milk, in the breast milk. There was a baby that died, a 5-month-old baby, that died one day after its mother got the second vaccine, mRNA vaccine.
It's terrible. And it seems to me like there is definitely a business side to all this. It's this perennial sickness industry, I think. It's inoculating people constantly. And it seems to me from what you're describing that the sickness is getting worse, it's getting more pronounced, and as a result you need more products for Parkinson's and all these other illnesses that flow on.
And the products don't work either. So this new Alzheimer's drug, I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's extremely expensive. And it has had very poor, it's not clear at all that it works, basically, and it's extremely expensive, and it's dealing with the amyloid beta. So it's just really incredible that they bring out these things that are so worse than useless, I think, in many cases. And people are so desperate for something that they're willing to try it. They've really got us. You've really got you in a bad place when you're very sick. You just give me something. I need something to fix this. Yeah. And they know that. So they're quite happy, I think. I think they probably love glyphosate because it's creating all these illnesses that are allowing them to sell all these drugs,
It's easy to become conspiratorial, I think, Stephanie, and I'm definitely inclined to that. When I see the machinery behind it all, I find it difficult not to think that there are interests sometimes that benefit from these kinds of things in such a way that, put it this way, if there was a malevolent group entity of some kind, and please hear me out, you don't have to answer this is just some stuff that I've been thinking about, that the virus itself, in conjunction with many of these potentially catastrophic and self-defeating effects of this vaccine, could put humankind in a perennial position of just needing medicine constantly, over and over again. Is it such a flight of fancy to think that someone could release something like this for this reason? Is it?
I know. That's the thing I think that, whether they knew, I think they knew glyphosate was toxic when they approved it. The company knew it from their studies, but whether they don't care that it's toxic or whether there's actually it wouldn't be so bad if people got sick, then we'd make more money kind of thought, It sounds so awful. And when I first entertained that thought, I really didn't want to believe it. But as I've lived longer and seen more, it becomes increasingly the most logical way to explain things. Things are so bizarre, and you're seeking a way to make rational sense out of it. And if you think about the fact that people make money when people are sick, and the U.S. government, can't figure out how to support the medical system in our country because so many people are in so much need. The expenses are out of sight. We can't solve the medical care problem in this country. We're very sick, but the government never seems to step back and say, geez, I wonder why Americans are so sick. They don't do that. And I really think glyphosate is a major player in the disease process and a major player in causing bad outcomes with COVID-19. So if we could just get rid of the glyphosate, I think we'd get a long ways towards a solution that would be much more pleasant and productive for everybody.
Absolutely. And here's hoping it can be done. I think people are becoming more aware of diet and glyphosate and various other things and where they're getting their food from and types of agriculture. So I can only hope that these grassroots movements end up really expanding. And I think they are. I think there is a glimmer of hope, but I guess we'll see. Well, I think it's an excellent way to finish up. This has been a really dense talk. There's a hell of a lot of information, and I know I'm going to have to go back and listen to it. For the audience, I'm going to put links to Stephanie's excellent book, which I've just recently finished reading, and I think everyone should read it. It's really good. And as well, the article that I've spoken about today and referenced today, which I'll also put in the show notes. I'm just wondering, Stephanie, do you have any parting words, perhaps even some advice about how people should try to manage this personally, this difficult time?
I think I've kind of given the advice that I would give, which is this certified organic whole foods diet. Spend the extra money on the food, and you will get that money back, and you'll feel a lot healthier. So you'll be a lot happier in doing that. It's worth it to spend more money, get the really high quality food. Eat well, and then get out in the sunlight, make sure your vitamin D is up, and also just sunlight in general. As far as medicines, I really don't even advocate taking supplements if you can avoid it. I think it's better to get your nutrition through natural foods. But I do recommend Epsom salt baths, which is a pretty easy thing to do, to just throw some Epsom salts into some hot water and soak. It's very relaxing. And the Epsom salts contain both magnesium and sulfate, both of which are critical nutrients that are deficient and are systemically in part because of glyphosate.
Excellent parting advice, and I can definitely get right behind that. So, Stephanie, thank you for coming on. It's been wonderful, and perhaps next time we can do something more on glyphosate, because we definitely left a lot on the table there, and it's definitely something that I'm passionate about is agriculture.
Right. Yes. And I think the sustainable, renewable agriculture is the way to go. Small farms. I think we need to go back to the small family farm.
Absolutely. And I think we will by necessity, even if
yes.
if they don't make us do it.
But, all right.
Time will tell.
Thank you.
Thank you.